The Buddha stood before the assembly, his gaze fixed on the quiet rows of listeners. He began not with comfort, but with a cold clarity. He spoke of the ignoble search, a cycle that consumes the life of the many. He mapped the trajectory of the human condition: birth, aging, sickness, and the inevitable approach of death. People chase what is subject to decay, tethering their existence to things that cannot last. He listed the traps: gold, silver, cattle, and the bonds of kin. He pointed out the flaw in this pursuit. Those who chase these things are themselves subject to the very same aging, the very same sickness, and the very same death that claim the objects of their desire. It is a loop of futility. One seeks what is impermanent, grasps it, and watches as it slips away into the hands of time. The assembly remained motionless as the weight of these words settled. Every attachment mentioned was a link in a chain, a foundation built upon shifting sand. There was no security in this path, only the constant, grinding repetition of loss and sorrow. He paused, letting the silence hang heavy, ensuring the reality of this cycle was felt by all who listened. The Buddha raised his hand, and the tension in the grove shifted. He spoke of a different path, one that diverged from the habitual chase. He called it the noble search. It began with a single, sharp realization: the danger inherent in all things that change. He asked his listeners to look at the world not through the lens of desire, but through the lens of impermanence. By recognizing that worldly gains are tethered to decay, one could finally stop the cycle. He defined this new search with absolute precision. It was not a quest for more, but a pursuit of the unborn, the unaging, the deathless, the undefiled. He described this as the supreme security of Nibbana, a state that stood outside the reach of time and loss. As he spoke, the gravity of the previous realization transformed into a focused intensity. He urged them to see that the choice was entirely their own. To pursue the temporary was to guarantee suffering, but to seek the permanent was to reach for an unshakable peace. The air in the grove grew still. The path forward was no longer a shadow, but a clear, deliberate direction for the mind to follow. The Buddha paused, his gaze turning inward as he recalled the moment he chose this path for himself. He was a young man then, surrounded by the comforts of a householder. He remembered the weight of his parents' tears, their hands clutching his arms as they pleaded for him to stay. He did not turn back. He reached for a blade and brought it to his head, the sharp scrape of metal against skin replacing the sound of their weeping. He removed the markers of his status, piece by piece, until he stood before them as a stranger. He took up the ochre cloth, wrapped it tight, and felt the rough texture against his skin. It was a final, tactile severance. He looked at his parents one last time, seeing their faces etched with the agony of loss, but his resolve remained as fixed as a mountain. He turned his back on the palace, his feet meeting the dust of the road. With every step away from the gates, the familiar life dissolved behind him. He did not look back. He walked until the voices of his kin were lost to the wind, committed entirely to the silence of the journey ahead. The road led him to the forest dwelling of Alara Kalama. He found the teacher seated under a canopy of ancient trees, his posture rigid, his breathing almost non-existent. The Buddha sat opposite him, mirroring the stillness. He surrendered his focus to the instruction. He pushed his mind beyond the grasp of objects, beyond the reach of forms, sinking into the silent, vast expanse of the base of nothingness. For days, he inhabited this void. He reached the heights his teacher claimed as the ultimate truth. He experienced the stillness, the void, the absolute vacancy of the state. Yet, when he opened his eyes, the world remained unchanged. The suffering of birth and the inevitability of death still waited in the shadows. He stood and looked at his hands, finding no release there. The stillness he had cultivated was a temporary refuge, not a final cure. He realized that this state, no matter how profound, would eventually fade. The cycle would pull him back into existence. His chest tightened with the weight of the failed attempt. He bowed to the teacher, turned away from the grove, and began to walk again, his mind burning with the need for a deeper, more permanent truth. The search continued until he reached the dwelling of Udaka Ramaputta. The air here was thin, heavy with the scent of pine and dry earth. He sat in the center of the gathering, closing his eyes to block out the world. He He followed the instructions with surgical precision, climbing the mental ladder beyond perception. Beyond even the absence of perception, he entered the base of neither perception nor non-perception. He stayed there, suspended in a state of hyper-refined consciousness where thought itself dissolved into a fine, flickering mist. For a time, it felt like the end of all striving. He held this state against the horizon of his own mortality. He waited for the crack, for the fading of the light, and it came. The state began to wobble, then collapse under its own weight. He realized that even this pinnacle was conditioned, subject to the same laws of birth and decay he sought to escape. He opened his eyes. The forest around him looked indifferent to his success. He stood up, his body stiff from days of immobility, and walked away from the teacher without a word. He was alone again, the ultimate goal still nowhere in sight, the path forward obscured by the failure of the world's highest teachings. He walked for weeks. The landscape shifted from the high, arid peaks to the lush, humid lowlands. The sound of running water became his only compass. He followed the river through dense thickets until the vegetation broke into a wide, clear-flowing channel at Uruvela. The water moved with a steady, relentless rhythm over smooth, gray stones. He stopped on the bank. The air here was cooler, saturated with the scent of damp soil and blooming jasmine. He scanned the area. There were no teachers here, no masters to follow, no instructions to memorize. The silence of the grove was heavy, pressing against his skin like a physical weight. He walked to the edge of a wide, ancient tree and inspected the ground. The earth was firm, packed hard by centuries of rain and sun. He cleared the debris, swept the leaves aside, and sat. He shifted his weight, testing the stability of the ground beneath him. It did not yield. He pulled his focus inward, discarding the memory of his past failures. His posture set like stone. He was finished with the roads. He was finished with the teachers. Here, the final confrontation would begin. He closed his eyes, and the world of the grove vanished. His breathing slowed until it was barely a tremor in his chest. Now, the real work began. He did not seek a state of transcendence. He sought the root of the trap. He turned his attention toward the mechanism of birth. He tracked the impulse, the craving that pulled consciousness back into the cycle of form, and he met it with a cold, unrelenting focus. The chains were not made of iron, but of habit. He saw the way the mind latched onto the sensation of aging, the fear of decay, and the desperate attachment to the self. He dismantled them piece by piece. When a thought of his past life surfaced, he did not fight it. He observed its origin and let it dissolve into empty space. He felt the internal resistance, a frantic, reflexive pulse of survival, and he held his ground against it. Each layer of conditioning was peeled back, exposed, and stripped of its power. He was dissecting the engine of existence while sitting perfectly still. The tension was absolute. He pushed past the comfort of meditation, past the silence, into the raw, unconditioned core of his own awareness. There was no room left for doubt. He was stripping away the final illusions that kept the cycle turning. The final barrier was the most subtle. It was the very impulse to seek, the last twitch of the observer trying to define the void. He saw it. He targeted the observer itself. The tension in his chest spiked, a sudden, blinding pressure that threatened to snap his resolve. He did not blink. He drove his awareness through the center of that resistance, and the floor dropped out from under his entire reality. The rigid walls of the self shattered. It was not a quiet fading, but a violent, total cessation of the friction that fueled existence. The cause and effect that kept the cycle spinning simply ceased to generate new momentum. Everything he had ever been, every memory, every name, every fear dissolved into a singular, infinite clarity. There was no more I to struggle, no more world to escape. The supreme security of Nibbana opened, vast and untouchable, like the silence after the collapse of a mountain. He was no longer a seeker. The search had consumed itself. The river of birth, aging, and death hit a dead end, leaving only the unconditioned, the unborn, and the permanent. He sat in the center of a stillness so absolute that it seemed to vibrate, a state beyond time, beyond reach, beyond any possible return to the old way. The stillness was not merely an absence of sound. It was a weight that reshaped the grove. He remained seated, but the tension that had defined his posture for years had evaporated. The ground beneath him seemed to hold him with a new, profound permanence. He opened his eyes. The change was instant and undeniable. Where there had been the fierce intensity of a seeker, there was now a light of absolute, piercing clarity. It was as if the very air around him had been scrubbed clean of all shadows. He did not move, yet he felt as though he occupied the entire space of the forest. The monks gathered at the edge of the clearing stopped their breathing, caught in the sudden, crushing gravity of his presence. He looked at the river, at the trees, at the very earth, and saw them without the filter of craving or aversion. The cycle that had driven him across countless lifetimes had ground to a halt, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt like the foundation of the world itself. He was the anchor, and the storm had finally passed. Every muscle in his face was relaxed, yet his gaze held a sharpness that cut through the confusion of the witnesses. They stared, paralyzed by the sight of a man who had become entirely, impossibly free. He rose from the earth. The movement was fluid, effortless, as if gravity had lost its hold on his frame. He stood in the center of the grove, his feet firm upon the soil, and looked toward the assembly. The silence he projected was not empty. It was full, heavy, with the weight of an unshakable truth. When he spoke, his voice did not echo against the trees. It seemed to emerge from the air itself, calm and resonant. "My liberation is unshakable," he said. The words hung in the space between the living things, stripping away the last remnants of doubt from the minds of those who listened. He looked at the horizon, then back at the monks, his expression carved into a stillness that would never again be disturbed by the tides of sorrow or desire. "This is my last birth," he continued. "Now there is no more renewed existence." The declaration settled over the forest like a cool mist. The struggle had ended. The path had reached its terminus. He stood motionless, a pillar of absolute clarity in a world that finally understood the meaning of peace. There was no more movement, no more reaching. Only the vast, untouchable security of the end, radiating outward until even the leaves seemed to hold their breath in witness to the finality.